Welcome back. We took a break over the Palm Sunday event and the Holy Week leading up to Easter, and I did a little segment interlude on that. Let's get back to Genesis. I've been looking at insights from the book of Genesis for a while now, and man, these are good. This time, let's look at chapter 39 in the book of Genesis. Let me get it before us, and if you have a Bible, turn to chapter 39 in Genesis. Let's look at it. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. "The Hebrew slave you brought us came to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But when Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Well, now that's a beautiful story and awesome. It is the inspired Word of God. Let's look at some of the details in it here. Moses, I believe, is the author, and he took a tangent and did a chapter on a narrative with Judah and Tamar. Now that's going to be important because there's going to be a divergence here, and two lines of the sons of Jacob are going to vie for messianic lineage. One is Joseph and his lineage, and the other is Judah and his lineage, each from different wives of Jacob. So Moses picks up the story here that he left off in chapter 37. And he tells us that those who took Joseph to Egypt were Ishmaelites. Now, that means that they were sons of Ishmael, the rejected son, the one who felt like he was the rejected son of Abraham. And later, earlier, I guess it is, they are called Midianites. Now, that wouldn't seem like much, but let's remember that Jethro, who became Moses' father-in-law, was the priest of Midian. So Midianites are going to come into the scene in the book of Exodus. Essentially, these are the same, and the terms Ishmaelites and Midianites are used interchangeably, but let's keep in mind Jethro is going to be a part of this, and that's going to play in the picture later on. Now, symbolically in the Bible, this tribe of people, the Midianites, represents a sexual and idolatrous threat. In other words, this group has a propensity to lead God's covenant people off into immorality and idolatry. Now, the Amalekites are a symbol of the sinful nature, but this more precisely, the Midianites have this other tendency. So this portion is not intended as a focus on the success of Joseph, how smart he was, how talented, how handsome, none of that stuff, even though it's there. But it focuses the faithfulness of God to the promise he had made to Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob. The phrase that we read in this passage is, the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. So it wasn't his talents or his giftedness and all that stuff. Here's another one in verses 3 and 4. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes. So God is blessing in spite of what appears to be a downturn of events and a tragedy here. There is a struggle here, as there was pictured for us back in Jacob and Esau in the womb. The twins in their mother's womb struggled, and then that struggle is projected through their lives. And the wrestling between the first and second born is again pictured in the sons of Tamar. And so in her womb, there is a struggle as well. And we're going to see this. And the struggle now is going to be between Judah, the tribe of Judah, and the tribe of Joseph and his sons. So temptation and moral indiscretion had previously been countered either by the Lord working through a Gentile like Abimelech. So God didn't scold Abraham for what he did wrong. He actually corrected the issue through Abimelech. But in this section and from here on, we have a different thing going on, and that's the focus on moral courage. So Joseph is pictured as one who has moral courage. He is upright and he doesn't succumb to temptation. So previously, the spotlight was on how faithful God had been in spite of human failure. Now the spotlight shifts to what God can do when humans respond in trust to him and obedience to him. They respond responsibly. And so we have a picture of grace and faith. Grace is what God does. Faith is our cooperation and response to his offer and his work and his will and so on. So previously, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all fell short of God's ideal standards, moral standards, even though they continued to believe in God and be part of the covenant, the promises of God made to Abraham. But now in these narratives, Joseph stands out as an example of one who trusts and obeys God's will, regardless of the temptations and the circumstances that he faces. In Genesis 18:19, God stated that Abraham was to teach God's standards to his children, that they may do righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may fulfill what he has promised to Abraham. Well, they didn't always do that, but God doesn't give up, and he's not in trouble because we mess up. But it's beautiful when we live righteously and uprightly. So there is a sense of human responsibility in the fulfillment of God's plan. And it begins to get clearly focused from here on, but it starts here in Genesis. So when humans do their part, both their way and their and their individual assets and reputations and all of that will prosper. So this is what's happening. Now there's balance here. Grace and faith always are seen in the Bible, and there are two components that are necessary. One is God's action, what he will do and can do, and the other is man's response, what God will not do without man's permission or cooperation. So human involvement in God's will is always an essential. So God is patient with us. Now we sometimes get off track, and God is patient, gets us back on track, and away we go. That doesn't mean that we're not messing things up and there will be some consequences, but we do have a part to play. So speaking and hearing are part of what we see. God speaks, and man has to hear with an intent to obey. So trust and obey, the songwriter writes, and we sing that song, that hymn, that old hymn, and it's very true. So together, these sections in Genesis 39 show us God's faithfulness in spite of human failure, and the beauty and necessity of human responsibility in the process of living well and glorifying God's name. This is the realized picture then of what we ascribe to Jeremiah and to Ezekiel about the new covenant theology. In new covenant theology, God doesn't predestine or determine everything. It's not determinism, but God offers and then man responds. And so in the new covenant, there is a cooperation with God's grace. So there are two themes. One is divine sovereignty, and the other is human responsibility. Now, in Christianity, we have a tendency to write off in either one of those, but balance is important here. Both are essential. God is sovereign, but he gave us free agency. He respects our choice. You see, love can't be love the way the Bible pictures it and the way God desires it to be, unless it is freely given, unless we love by choice. And so that's human responsibility. They're woven together by means of God's Spirit and by means of what Ezekiel calls a new heart, a heart of flesh. So God takes out the heart of stone, puts in a heart of flesh, and writes his law on our heart, and then gives us his Spirit to enable us to do his will. So the combination of God's Spirit and a God-given new heart is the secret to the ability to consistently do God's will, to live what we would call a victorious life. Or sometimes we ascribe it to spiritual formation. So there's something God does, something we must do, including the spiritual disciplines that we talk about. Discipleship, that involves some spiritual disciplines, and those help us mature in all of this. There's an interesting thing here. Only Joseph in the book of Genesis is said to have been filled with the Spirit of God. Now, later in the Bible, we're going to read about how the Spirit came on, like Saul when he was made king, or prophets. But in Genesis here, there's a unique phrase that Joseph was filled with the Spirit of God. There's an epilogue to this story, and so let me just kind of wrap it up and review it in this. And it tells us that God faithfully turned an intended evil against Joseph into a good, a blessing, not just for Joseph, but for his family and for all people. He later says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Now, this doesn't preclude suffering and inconvenience and struggle and misery and all of the nasty things that we dislike. Sometimes those are part of the process, and we have to be patient because people do bad things. God, however, knows how to turn crucifixions into resurrections. So the object is to trust God, and that often requires patience and endurance in difficult situations, times that we don't understand and we can't see the why to it. So in Hebrews, we're told that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And you see, that's true back here all the way in the book of Genesis, pictured in the life of Joseph. So the assurance is that God will always do his part. There is no question whatever that God is about the business of doing what he promised to do. The question always is, will we do our part? Will we be true and faithful and upright? That's the struggle. Now, God has a way to help us with that, but he will not bypass our will. He never imposes himself or his will upon us. We must cooperate with him. Isn't that a great story? Well, all tucked away here in Genesis. And thanks for joining me for a look at it today. God bless you.